Presidential candidate and Congressman Ron Paul debates United States foreign policy with Dinesh D'Souza, Larry Abraham, and Doug Casey. Titled, Should We Fight the War on Terror in the Middle East and Around the Globe? From this year's Freedom Fest in Las Vegas. This is an hour, 10 minutes.
Opening this debate on U.S. foreign policy is Ron Paul. And paladin of liberty and constitutional policy and an eloquent voice for libertarian values.
Give a warning then. Thank you very much. Good to be back. Good to visit with you. This morning I did talk about foreign policy a bit, and I've been talking a lot about foreign policy over the last 6 months. Matter of fact, over the last decade or two, I have been talking about foreign policy. To me, it's not a complicated issue. If you look at the traditions of this country, it really was built on a non-interventionist foreign policy. And that is built on our Constitution, because it did not give permission, the Constitution has not given permission for us to so-called police the world or spread our goodness, our so-called goodness. Everything changed at the beginning of the last century, and in particular in 1914 with Woodrow Wilson, with his idealistic notion that through force you can spread our democracy around the world. Although the people weren't ready for it, those demagogues who got control of our government were able to persuade the people. And when you think about it throughout the 20th century, those individuals that advocated non-interference and non-intervention generally won the election, almost always. So it was Wilson who was contriving us to get into World War I all along. In 1916, went on, I'm going to keep us out of the war. And also FDR, likewise in 1940, although Europe was in a blaze already, he promised to keep American boys at home. So that was our tradition. That was the American feeling of non-intervention and neutrality and minding our own business. We were taking the advice of the founders who said, don't get involved. And quite frankly, the Constitution doesn't permit it. The Constitution does talk about war, and it says that if need be, the war should go ahead only with a declaration of war. One of the prime reasons of removing the control of foreign policy from the executive branch and this power to declare war was because of the oppression of the king, and they wanted to take it away from the executive branch. And they were explicit in saying that the Congress, that body that was closest to the people, would have the say that we would not go to war. And the purpose of this is to go to war rarely. And when you do, you go with a consensus, and you go with the idea that you will go and win the war and get it over with. Even though we got into wars, especially World War I, which was essentially because of World War II, the wars at least were declared. But after World War II, once we had started to give up our concept of national sovereignty and came in under the United Nations, we went to war hardly with a blink from the Congress by going to war in Korea without a declaration. The strongest opponents at that time were the old right conservative Republicans who opposed this, and yet we ended up in Korea undeclared, and the war wasn't won. We drifted once again because we rejected the notion of non-intervention. We ended up going into Vietnam, and we lost that war. We are achieving so much more now in peace than we ever were able to achieve in war. We went over there to tell them how to live and make sure that they were westernized and we had control. It was a total failure. Since we lost in Vietnam, we have followed more the advice of the founders, and the founder says non-intervention, don't fight with people, have free trade, talk to people, trade with people, go back and forth, but don't get involved in their internal affairs. It's good advice, it was good advice then, it's great advice today. I wish we would follow it. But there are a lot of shortcomings from interventionism. One, it usually never, even though there are always justifications for it, always the good justification, inevitably there are unintended consequences, all bad. And there is this principle that we talked about in the debates next called blowback. And when you interfere and get involved in other countries and you do it long enough, you're finally going to aggravate them. And that is what happened. All I'd like to suggest is that if you have a little bit of difficulty in accepting a total non-interventionist foreign policy, always see it through the light of a political aspect of looking upon it, what it would be like if we were receiving the same treatment. What would we think if the Chinese were over here and they had their navy in the Gulf of Mexico and they had troops on our land? And they were teaching us to live like the Chinese and teaching us about their religion and their laws. We would be outraged, and we would fight, and we would do anything. And yet we go over complacently thinking that all we have to do is go over there and we are going to westernize that region. Now, I have used the quote from Ronald Reagan that he had a lesson he learned in a difficult situation. He sent troops in the early 1980s to Lebanon. I was in the Congress at the time and spoke out strongly against it. And he, at the time, when he sent the troops, he said, one thing, I'll never turn tail and run. Before you know it, the Marines were killed, and Reagan took the troops out. And then he explained this in his biography. And he said, Reagan said, I would never turn tail and run. But finally, after he realized the irrationality of the politics and the hatreds of that region, we changed our policy there. And that's a down-to-earth lesson, and he learned it, but we didn't learn it. And here we are still, proposing that we go over and get involved overseas. In a practical sense, we've been involved for a long time. World War I, we shouldn't have been in it. We were demanding a spot at the table in the Versailles Treaty. The Versailles Treaty led literally to World War II. And also, those boundaries that exist after the Ottoman Empire broke down, the boundaries of the Middle East, drawn up by the West, Europeans and Americans. And we're still fighting over those artificial boundaries. And then in 1953, it was decided that democracy was not for the Iranians. Now we're dying to spread democracy, but the Iranians have an election, elect Mohammad Mossadegh, who also was a physician, and we didn't like him because he was serving the interests of the Iranians and attacking the foreign interests of the British and the American Petroleum Company. So he was standing up for his people. So what do? We throw him out of office through the CIA. And we wonder why they get angry and upset. So when did the blowback come? Probably not till 1979. After 25 years of the Shah, they get a bit annoyed, but they don't forget. We remember nothing, they forget nothing. So this helped precipitate the growth of the radical Islamists. Matter of fact, we literally in the 80s subsidized the madrasa schools, the radical Islamists, because we thought, oh, this will be good. We need radicals because they're going to attack the communists. And besides, Osama bin Laden is our friend. And we're fighting for him because he's a freedom fighter. I mean, the absurdity of the intervention is just unbelievable that people still accept it, because it always has negative consequences, and it goes on and on and on. We were partners with Saddam Hussein. Matter of fact, we were his allies, said, go get Iranians, invade Iran. So he did, and of course, he was a bad guy, and he used terrible weapons. He used gas, but where did he get the gas? From us. It has to stop, and it can't stop by having a better managed war in Iraq. Those who are changing their opinion, and they're changing their opinion in droves today on Iraq, and it's not because we have mismanaged the war, it is because we have a bad foreign policy. We have a foreign policy that endorses interventionism. We need a foreign policy which is constitutional, conservative, wise, and that is the policy of non-intervention. We ought to stay at home, mind our own business, trade with people, and be friends with people, and we all would be a lot better off.
The next speaker is Dinesh D'Souza, who is the leading he's still young, conservative writer in America, and is a fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, and one of America's most influential conservative thinkers, that's clear. And he just writes a stream of books. He's got another one out shortly, and his last one was The Incendiary Enemy at Home. Dinesh D'Souza.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be back at Freedom Fest. I want to violate the spirit of the debate a little bit by praising Ron Paul. I want to say how impressed we are as conservatives that he is saying things that not only libertarians but also conservatives believe. I also want to say that Larry Abraham and I are here not as defenders or shills, but in some ways as critics of the Bush administration. This may seem a little surprising. I think where we disagree with our opponents is that they criticize Bush for getting involved, and we criticize him for not winning the war. So our disagreement is, in a sense, tactical. I also want to say a word of criticism, if I may, of libertarianism. And what I mean by this is that libertarianism, to be consistent, should be a defense of the principle of liberty. Now, it is liberty and not any other principle that should be at the forefront. Non-intervention is a useful thing, but it is subordinate to the primary principle of liberty. So the dilemma of the libertarian is, if you can intervene abroad to secure liberty, should you do it, or should you abstain in the name of a non-interventionism that would undermine the promotion of liberty abroad? Now, it could be argued that we should not intervene. Ron Paul focused his argument on non-intervention because it seems for a libertarian to be somehow paradoxical, to say the least, to use force to promote freedom. There seems something inherently contradictory in employing coercion to try to secure liberty. But let us remember, looking around the world, that while it's very easy to say things like you can't impose freedom at the point of a bayonet, when you look at the actual world, we see that you can, and we did. The United States imposed freedom at the point of a bayonet on Japan and on Germany after World War II, and the results have been very positive for freedom. Imagine if we hadn't done it. Usually when freedom comes to a country, this may be a regrettable truth about politics or human nature, it alas comes by force. How did we get freedom in this country? We had a revolution. Revolutions are rarely peaceful and never legal. How did African Americans get freedom? It took a civil war to secure for the slaves a freedom that they were in no position to secure for themselves. So freedom sometimes does come by force. I find it interesting that we had a defense of non-intervention that didn't really focus on the subject of our debate, which is Iraq. I want to say a few words about that. I was on a college campus the other day, and someone said to me, Mr. D'Souza, in retrospect, would you admit that the Iraq invasion by Bush was a mistake? And I said to him, in retrospect, I would admit it. In retrospect, I wish the United States had focused a little more attention on Iran. Iran has been the first major state to fall into the hands of the Islamic radicals. The Iranians were apparently pursuing the weapons of mass destruction with the same zeal and clearly more success than Saddam. So with the benefit of hindsight, we maybe should have focused our attention there. But I said, let's not be too cocky about it, because the truth is, no statesman ever got to make a decision in retrospect. The statesman, like the entrepreneur, is in the moving current of events, and you have to make decisions with the information available at the time. Now, one can say today, with the benefit of some hindsight, why are we in Iraq? What are we trying to achieve there? Let me answer that question in this very simple way. Try to imagine yourself as a young Muslim who lives in the Middle East. If you look around that part of the world, you see a very interesting sight. You see two types of regimes, two types of government. On the one hand, you see Islamic tyranny. And what's an example of Islamic tyranny? Iran, the rule of the mullahs. On the other hand, you see what can be called secular tyranny. What's an example of secular tyranny? Everybody else. Assad in Syria, Abdullah in Jordan, the royal family in Saudi Arabia, Mubarak in Egypt, the Gulf kingdoms. The list goes on. So the truth of it is, from the ordinary Muslim's point of view, there is, in a sense, no freedom in the Middle East. Should I go for Islamic tyranny or should I go for secular tyranny? It's not all that surprising that some Muslims, being Muslim, choose to go for Islamic tyranny. So the United States is attempting in Iraq to put a third option on the table. Call it Muslim democracy. Now, I want to pull back here because there are lots of silly people who have been prancing around saying, the United States is the world's policeman. The United States is going to promote democracy everywhere. Nonsense. The United States is not the world's policeman. It is not our job to promote, it is not our job to be deposing and defenestrating and tyrants all over the world. No. In Iraq, we are not trying to impose democracy everywhere, but we are just trying to impose it somewhere, to give the Muslims an alternative to the forms of tyranny that dominate their world. Now, it is very important that we succeed in Iraq, because if we don't, the core libertarian value of freedom will be undermined worldwide. Think about it. What is the most unfree part of the world today? It's the Middle East. Iraq represents an effort, and Bush may be doing a terrible job of it, and he may be failing, but at least he's trying. He is trying to implant the seed of democracy in a part of the world that's never known it. The Islamic radicals already control one major country, Iran. They have been trying for more than a generation now to export the Khomeini revolution to other major Muslim countries. They have not succeeded. Iran was an unexportable revolution in part because of the peculiarity of that country. Iran is Persian and not Arab. It is Shia and not Sunni. The Islamic radicals are desperate to get their hands on another major state, and they have very clearly said it should be Iraq. They have already announced in their videos and in their pamphlets that if they get Iraq, they will then target Egypt and Saudi Arabia. So what is the libertarian position on this? To sit back and watch the entire Middle East fall one after another into the hands of ruthless people? I mean, if the United States, bolstering the Iraqi government, cannot defeat the insurgency, you think they can do it all by themselves? In other words, we are facing a situation where realism forces us to admit that we do have vital interests over there. It is not some woolly-headed pursuit of idealism alone. It is also the pursuit of our own economic welfare and our own basic security. Now, what happens if we do what our opponents want us to do, which is basically to leave? I want to bring us back, in a sense, to 9/11. What was it that made the radical Muslims confident enough to do it? Think about this. The radical Muslims, after the Cold War, all went back to their own countries. Bin Laden went back to Saudi Arabia. Al-Zawahiri went back to Egypt. They were fighting to overthrow what they called the near enemy, their own governments. And then they made a very fateful decision to shift strategy and attack the United States. And the interesting question is why? Why did they decide to attack the world's sole superpower? If you can't overthrow Musharraf in Pakistan or Mubarak in Egypt, what makes you think you can attack the United States and get away with it? Bin Laden answers this question very clearly. He says, my intuition was that the United States is basically outwardly tough, but inwardly a bunch of cowards. The United States is all talk and all bluster and can lob a few big bombs, but when the fighting gets tough, the United States will turn tail and run. They did it in Vietnam, they'll do it again. So the radical Muslims have operated under the presupposition that there is a sort of weakness, a decadence, a cowardice at the heart of the United States. And my fear is that, in a sense, if we pull out of Iraq, what are we doing? Consider the situation of an insurgent in Iraq, an insurgent fighting against the US military. There are captured al-Qaeda documents that have repeatedly shown that the insurgents confess we cannot defeat the US military. In other words, we have been reduced, they say, to hit and run operations. But why are they hanging in there? Why are they even trying to escalate in Iraq? And the answer is very simple. The Iraqi insurgents and the Islamic radicals have figured out that they don't have to beat us. They don't have to defeat the US military. They don't have to drive us out of the Middle East. They only have to hang in there a little longer for the great impatience and weariness of the American people, stoked by the political left and by some libertarians who basically say, let's pick up the tent, let's go, let's leave. So the dearest objective of the Islamic radicals is being achieved not by bin Laden making videos persuading us to leave, but by a domestic political force in this country, in a sense, pushing to achieve what our enemies want the most. Ultimately, I think if we believe in freedom, we should recognize that we should be prudent in the use of it. We should be careful not to avoid foolishness. We should plan well for the future. But ultimately, freedom, I want to suggest, is a principle that is, in the end, worth fighting for. Thank you.
Larry Abraham is chairman and founder of Pan American Capital Group and the longtime writer and editor of Insider Report, an international geopolitical investment newsletter with over 10,000 private subscribers worldwide. He's an international best-selling author, speaker on political, economic, and financial topics. After living in South America for 7 years, he now resides in the Seattle area and serves on the boards of major consultancies in North America and China. Larry Abraham.
Thank you, Mr. Gilder. Let me just say one thing about this panel before we start, before I go to my comments. One thing that I'm most encouraged about, having been speaking at conferences like this for almost 40 years, I'm delighted to see the leadership in such capable hands as young conservatives like Dinesh D'Souza. That is really a remarkable achievement. And I started following his career when he was making life miserable for a bunch of people who so richly deserved it when he was up at Dartmouth. Doug Casey and I have shared panels together forever, it seems like. And I never thought I would live to see the day that Doug Casey was on the same side of an argument as Walter Cronkite. I find that a little hard to get my arms around, Doug, and I hope you understand the emotional upset that causes me. But let's make one thing clear in this debate. Neither Dinesh D'Souza or I are here to defend 93 years of what appears to be at times idiotic, schizophrenic, and totally insane foreign policy. I'm not here to do that. And furthermore, let me say that I every year admire, whenever the new Congress comes into existence, that this gentleman, Ron Paul, always introduces a resolution or a bill in Congress, the House of Representatives, to get us out of the United Nations. I think that would be... that not only would be a major start, that would be the major beginning to many of the ideals that we're talking about and share in this audience. How can we constantly turn over our foreign policy making decisions to the United Nations? That would be like Eliot Ness turning over the crime fighting to the Council of the Mafia. It makes no sense. Now, oftentimes in recent days, we keep hearing about Reagan cutting and running in Lebanon. Who really set the stage for the cut and run in Lebanon? The same people who are setting the stage for the cut and run today, the editorial board of the New York Times. Is there a war going on or is there not? My problem with what's going on today is not that Mr. Bush went to war, it's that he went to war with political correctness as part of his war plan. He said early on that the people who made this attack were aided and abetted by people who financed it, encouraged it, did this, did that, and that anybody who was a part of that great plan would be viewed as an enemy of this country. I submit to you that is not happening. The major proponents of the war in Iraq are not coming from the circle inside the White House. The major proponents for the war in Iraq are coming from radical Islam. And you know, ladies and gentlemen, the first tenet of successful war, or the art of war, as Sun Tzu Wu called it, was know your enemy and know yourself. He said if you know your enemy and know yourself, your victory will be assured. But if you don't know either, your defeat is a foregone conclusion. How many Americans really have taken the time to know what it is that we're dealing with? These people who hate us for what they believe to be profoundly deep and worthy reasons, but it isn't just something that just cropped up. This rancor goes back to the Battle of Tours, goes to Lepanto, certainly as recently as the 1920s and the rise of Wahhabism and the Saudi Peninsula, certainly the Ayatollah Khomeini in 1979. We aren't paying attention. And let me point out something to you that happened on September 12th, 2001. That is absolutely essential to understanding why this war is being waged the way it is. On September 12th, 2001, probably even before the clock ticked 12, the first thing the administration did was to try and make sure they could bolster the regimes of Mubarak in Egypt and Musharraf in Pakistan. Now, you may not think this is worthy of an argument, but let me try to give you a short look at a nightmare. Musharraf in Pakistan goes down. It is well understood by everybody who knows anything about this situation that radical Islam has penetrated the highest orders of the Pakistani army, and at that moment, the minute he goes down, those very forces are armed with a nuclear weapon. According to what Mr. al-Zawahiri says, do you think they will hesitate to use it? Their whole life, their whole existence, their whole being is to kill Americans and to kill Jews. You think they won't use it? Do you think they won't close down the Suez Canal in a heartbeat if Mubarak goes down? From Indonesia to Morocco, you have probably no more than 3,000 mullahs, so-called holy men, who are inciting this war. What sort of mentality? Now, this is what you're dealing with. It isn't a Republican liberal debate. It isn't a conservative libertarian debate. What sort of people What sort of mindset says, look, my one and only son, beloved flesh of my flesh, let me strap bombs on you and have you go out and kill innocent people. Allah Akbar. Allah Akbar. That's a reality, folks. We're not here to, my friend Dinesh D'Souza and I are not here to defend 93 years of misbegotten foreign policy. We're here to take a look at the hand we've been dealt right now. And if we don't look at the hand we've been dealt right now in its reality, sometime we're going to get called. And it isn't going to be pleasant. It isn't like this is just a contrivance of Hollywood, or this is just a redo of the Vietnam War. I remember during the Vietnam War, I was out speaking on college campuses asking the question, when are we going to win the war in Vietnam and why not? We could have. At least when that charade and that abominable bit of treason became full force in our life, we could at least retreat to our shores. But that wasn't the office towers in Kuala Lumpur that got hit on September 11th. Those are the office towers at the World Trade Center, and Madrid, and London. And if you don't think for a minute that they won't use the same tactics that were used for saffron gas in the subways of Tokyo, stop and think about this for a minute. You might want to make it a political debate for power, but that makes you no better than the most radical left-wing Democrat who would do anything as long as it means the political demise of George Bush. There's a hell of a lot more at stake here than the political demise of George Bush. Thank you.
The final speaker is Doug Casey, who's author of the bestsellers Strategic Investing, Crisis Investing, and Crisis Investing for the Rest of the 90s. He's had to change his biography. It says he's lived in 7 countries. That should be 12 countries, and visited over 120 more. His firm, Casey Research, publishes a variety of newsletters and websites with a combined weekly audience in excess of 200,000, largely high net worth investors with an interest in resource development and international real estate. He's the founder of the Eros Society, and that's not Eros, that's not love, that's war. How he will reconcile that contradiction, we'll see. Doug Casey.
I consider it a shameful thing that this subject even has to be debated. What the U.S. did was attack a backward, primitive country that had done nothing to it, that used to be a bosom ally of this corrupt government here in the U.S. And I can tell you this, that if a Muslim army had attacked the U.S., I should hope that every American would be out there every night trying to kill a Muslim soldier, just like those people are out every night trying to kill an American soldier. Now, this war, for which there's no excuse whatsoever, and I listened to these guys, there's no excuse for it whatsoever, in my opinion. This is complete rhetoric and sophistry that you've been listening to. This war is counterproductive. It cannot possibly have any good upshots at all. I'll tell you why. It's going to destroy freedom in this country. This place, when the Muslims who feel that we're attacking Islam, this is an extension of the Crusades, and I don't want to go who started the Crusades. Was it them or us, and back and forth? Forget about it. This is ancient history, literally. When the next 9/11 happens in this country, because of the way this country has been bureaucratized into a national security state, They're going to lock this place down like one of their numerous new federal prisons. And let me tell you something. If you ain't got out by then, you're going to be in a world of trouble, because none of you people, you're all the usual suspects. You're considered enemies of the state, even coming to something like this. And I'll be surprised if there isn't some spook, some creep, somebody from some federal agency here taking names and writing them down, because that's what's happened in this country, and that's what happens in a war economy. That happened in this country, it's happened in the Civil War, it happened in World War I and World War II, and by God, it's really going to happen in earnest now, because they've got a gigantic bureaucracy that wants to find something to do. So the first thing this war is going to do, it's going to just totally destroy American freedom, which has been on the slippery slope for a long, long time. Second thing it's going to do is it's going to totally bankrupt the U.S. government, which Vietnam went a long way towards doing. I see this as a double-edged sword. Perhaps that's a good thing. I mean, as Nietzsche said, that which is about to fall deserves to be pushed. So, and the third thing is, and this is very serious, is it's creating new enemies. People that loved the idea of America now see us as a dangerous, criminal bully around the world. So it's doing absolutely no good whatsoever. Now, winning the war, you know, it's funny. People say, oh, you're anti our troops. We got to support our troops and so forth. Let me tell you something. You remember during Vietnam, the average American, it seemed, they were spitting on those soldiers when they came home and so forth. All right? Now, if you're not actively supporting the soldiers, the shoe's on the other foot. I think it's all mass hysteria. It's all mass hysteria driven by rhetoric and fear. And it's been brought up, we have to do this to defend America. This is complete nonsense. What these people are going to do is start World War III. Because even though we attacked, it's shameful. I mean, why don't we pick on somebody our own size? You attack a 20 million person country where the people are starving, they got no technology, they've got nothing, okay? We pick on these nothing, nowhere countries that can't possibly be a threat to us. But it's going to wind up, especially if they take this war to Iran, it's going to wind up as World War III. And that's going to be really, really unpleasant. And that's the big danger. Now, who's the enemy? Well, they say, well, wait a minute, it worked when we attacked Germany and Japan. This is ridiculous. You can't make this comparison. First of all, these were modern, industrialized countries, and you were fighting a one-to-one type war. Here, you're getting into a guerrilla war where you're fighting the people. You don't even know who you're fighting. You're not even fighting a government. You're fighting, and not even Al-Qaeda. You're not even fighting Al-Qaeda. This is another nonsense. They like to say we're fighting Al-Qaeda so that it seems like we've got one enemy, one snake that if you crush the head, then we can go home. No. What they've done is they've created 50, 100 Al-Qaedas. It's like they said in Vietnam. Remember? 2, 3, many Vietnam? Well, now you've got 50 or 100 of these groups. They all like each other. They're all sympathetic with each other. They all communicate each other. They all have ties or links, like they say. But Al-Qaeda is a big nothing. You've got 50 or 100 of them that have been created by this. You can't win a guerrilla war. Who's the real enemy in this? It's not these primitive, backward Muslims, for Christ's sake. It's the U.S. government that's the danger. You know, during the Vietnam War, and I'm a big fan of Muhammad Ali's, and I was back then too. And when he heroically declined to be drafted into that slave army, he said, I ain't got no beef with no Viet Cong. No Viet Cong ever called me nigger. And frankly, I've got no beef with the Muslims. I mean, those of you who heard me earlier say, I don't believe in Islam and I don't believe in Christianity. To me, it all should be flushed, all of it. But they're just human beings. They're misguided. They're attacking us because we attacked them. That's what's going on. Are we defending democracy? Should we bring democracy to them? What is this? What are we, busybodies? We know best and we'll give you something that we think is good? This is embarrassingly insane. Anyway, is democracy a good thing? No. It's nothing but mob rule dressed up in a sports coat. And what should have been done? What should have been done about 9/11? Should we have attacked Beijing because the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, which is exactly what we did here? No, it was a criminal act, and it should have been treated like a giant criminal act, not as a cause for war. And the last thing is, well, you're wondering, well, now that we're in there, we have to win it. Well, you can't win it. It is impossible, and the chances are, with these maniacs that are running the government, and I think Bush, certainly Cheney, he may be criminally insane, actually. This thing could really blow up out of total control, certainly if Iran gets involved, because now you're hunting big game. And the average Iranian is going to go from being still very sympathetic, anti his government, still sympathetic towards the US. It's going to turn it around entirely, and you're really going to whack the hornet's nest then. So how do we stop this war now that it's been started? Certainly not by trying to win it. That's the definition of insanity. You know what insanity is? It's continuing to do something that's failed and failed and failed and doing it again and again and again. I'll tell you what you do. Here's what you do. If I was president of the United States, and I hope Ron Paul, who's, I don't know if he's the only decent person in Congress, but he's absolutely the only decent human being running for president this year. And if through some act of providence of some type, Ron won, what I would advise him to do is 3 things to solve this problem. End this war with Islam before it spins out of control and before America becomes the most hated nation since the Roman Empire. Number 1, withdraw all U.S. troops from the 100 countries where we have significant, all of them. They all come home. All those soldiers are doing is picking up lots of bad habits in those countries. Number 2, stop meddling in these countries' governments. Stop overthrowing their governments. Stop giving foreign aid to Israel and Egypt. Gone, all of it. And number 3, apologize sincerely and openly for having done these terrible things to these poor people with our soldiers. And you know what I think? I think those people are going to stand down and slip back into the Dark Ages, which is, where they are. So that's my answer to the...
We'll have short rebuttals between 3 and 4 minutes in the reverse order. So, Larry Abraham.
Doug is always very, very clever with the soundbite and the Mencken-esque type comment, which I usually enjoy. But I don't enjoy being called a sophist in this particular instance or under these circumstances, because I'm not dealing in sophistries, I'm dealing in realities. I never said one thing that wasn't a reality as it relates to what it is we're facing. Now, who started it? We could debate that forevermore. You could say it was started at the Battle of Tours. Or you could say, it was a hangover from Lepanto. Or it was the British and the French screwing up the Arabs at the end of World War I. I don't know where it started. But I do know that you don't treat 9/11 as a great big giant workfare program for the ACLU. It was a hell of a lot more than a criminal act by a few criminals. And if you are going to treat the enemies of this country as just so many potential clients for the ACLU, you definitely won't win the war. You definitely will have insanity run amok. You definitely will have the beginning or the end of what Doug called World War III. We didn't start it. We didn't start it. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever experienced this, but let me ask you to just try and think about it for just 10 seconds. Have you ever been hated and wanted dead simply because of who and what you are? No. Every Jew that lives in Israel knows that feeling. Every one. And if you don't think that you can moan and but every day there's somebody over there thinking about how can we go kill those people. They deserve to die. They're worse than pigs. And that transference of hatred is more than just to the citizens of Israel today. It's to the American people. Now, Doug has an awful lot of contempt for this country, and he doesn't hesitate to spit it out and make it at times very humorous. But I don't think that this country is deserving of contempt. We've made mistakes, yeah. But who are we going to blame for those mistakes? Are we, the conservatives, those people who are advocates of liberty, are we the framers of those mistakes? No. Now, I have a son in the Marine Corps right today. He's in Fort Lejeune. He'll be in Fallujah soon. But I had a son on the Eisenhower in Desert Storm, and another son in the Marine Corps before that. Does that make me a fool? I don't think so. Does that make my sons just worthless battle cannon fodder? I don't think so. If Doug is right, and this country is as contemptuous as he says it is, and if the people who agree with him, who are wearing headbands and shouting Ali Akbar, then this debate will be just so much formality, but a prelude to chaos, confusion, and genocide.
Doug, do you want to answer that?
Listen, I got to say, Larry and I have been friends for 30 years. We love each other. But we do disagree on this, Larry. I mean, first of all, and Larry accused me of being a rhetorician, but Larry is an excellent rhetorician. Israel, okay? I've got no problem with Israel. I've got no problem with the Jews. I've got no problem with the Arabs or the Muslims. I just don't want a dog in that fight, that's all. And as far as the Arabs and the Muslims hating the Jews, no, they don't, and they never did. The fact of the matter is before the creation of the State of Israel, and the fact of the matter is, the Jews stole that land. I don't care about what the Bible says, it's our historic property. They basically stole it from the residents there. You know, and I'm not anti-Israel, I'm not anti-Jew, I'm just calling it the way I see it. The fact is that before the Aliyahs started, okay, before the Jews started massive immigration, the Jews that were there got along fine with the Muslims and with the Christians. It was the imposition of a political structure. This is why I'm an anarchist, for God's sake. Well, no, it's the state of Israel's fault. It's the creation of a state. And that's where the people that aren't controlling the state are disenfranchised. That's the problem. So I don't know how it's going to work out. It's a big problem, but I don't have a dog in that fight, and I don't think you ought to either. They got to work it out between each other. And Larry also said that I have contempt for the country. No, I have never said that. I said I have contempt for the government. And am I a pacifist? No, I'm not a pacifist. I'm personally of the opinion there are a number of people in the world that need killing. But I'm also of the opinion that if you want to kill somebody, you ought to do it yourself. And And you shouldn't try to get control of some slimy government to force me and other people to force people to go over there and pay for, and have others of us pay so we can be busybodies on your account, okay? That's all I'm saying.
Wow, this debate has really degenerated. Somewhat like the mosquito in the nudist colony, I'm trying to decide where to begin. Well, look, I'm in no way offended by all these quips and so on. This stuff only gets me going. But I do think that the issue here isn't just the government, the American government. It's also a little bit of what the American founders stood for. And as libertarians, you believe they stood for liberty. As conservatives, we believe they stood for liberty. That's why we're trying to conserve that. Now, is liberty only good for us? Yes. And if so, we celebrate, we have to distinguish, you may say, the unprincipled libertarian who believes in it only for me, from the principled libertarian, which would be the American founders, who believed that liberty was a universal aspiration. Now, all men are created equal, not just all Americans, all men. Go read it up. Now, this idea of 9/11 as a police action, let's go get the guys who did 9/11. Memo to our opponents, the guys who did 9/11 are all dead. So if that's the war on terror as they see it, they may as well declare it over. What about all the hundreds of thousands of people coming out of the madrasas and the mosques, signing up for jihad, committing bombings all over the world? This is a little bit of a bigger problem, and George Bush, dumb as he is, at least realizes that. Now, this idea that we should pull all our troops home from everywhere and get involved nowhere, I mean, it's one thing if our opponents disagreed about Iraq, but if you took this idiotic principle and applied it over the past 10 or 50 or 100 years, is it the idea that if FDR doesn't like Hitler, he should go choke him himself? Yeah. Okay. I'm facing opponents who insist on imploding themselves. I don't have to really defeat them. All right. Blowback. Look, foreign policy is ultimately about the principle of the lesser evil. You sometimes ally with the bad guy to get rid of the worst guy. In World War II, we allied with the really bad guy, Stalin, because Hitler posed a greater threat at the time. We've heard all kinds of nonsense. We sold Saddam those weapons of mass destruction. In fact, we sold Saddam nothing. The United States diplomatically tilted to Saddam in the 80s, but why? Because it was the time of the Iran-Iraq war. The guy on the other side was Khomeini, who posed then, and I would argue poses now, a greater threat at the time. What about this idea about blowback? This is actually, I think, a case where our opponents have accidentally stumbled upon the truth. It is true that we are seeing a blowback against what? Think about this. Are you telling me that the ordinary Muslim in the Sudan or Somalia or Islamabad is putting bullets on his chest and ready to go to his death because the Palestinians don't have a state? Give me a break. Are you telling me the ordinary Muslim is willing to kill himself because there are U.S. troops in Mecca? There are no U.S. troops in Mecca. The U.S. base is 500 miles away in the Saudi desert. It makes no sense. The radical Muslims are not saying that on the Arab street. What they are saying is this: They are saying that the United States is the global head of the unbelievers or the pagans. That the United States is exporting through globalization, through free trade, values that are undermining Islam, destroying the Muslim family, and corrupting the innocence of the Muslim children. Does even Ron Paul know how to stop that? You think that pulling our troops home is going to stop that? Their argument is that Islam is under attack, that the fundamental values that they stand for are threatened. I would argue that they're being threatened far more by the universal export of American values and American culture. I watched an interesting interview with a radical sheikh on a European TV station. Someone told him, Europe is more decadent than America. Why don't you guys focus on Europe? Why is America the head of the snake? And his answer was very simple. He said, because it is American culture that is spreading worldwide. Young Muslims don't want to crack Swedish jokes or go to French films. It is American values and American ideas that are at the root of this. Either we stand up for these values or we go down with them. Thank you.
First off, I'm just wondering whether I should still offer the vice presidency to Doug Casey. But, you know, 9/11, they say we don't talk about 9/11. Well, we try to put it in a perspective. It was a criminal act, and part of it was it came about because, and it was so disastrous, mainly because we have so little respect for the Second Amendment and personal responsibility for our property. If we would have treated our passengers and the responsibility of airlines like we do, like we allowed the banks control their money in their armored cars, people don't blow up and rob those cars. Why, if the responsibility had been on the airlines to protect their passengers and we didn't have the federal government taking over the security, the airlines might well have had guns in those cockpits and they probably wouldn't even attack us. And if they did, they would have been shot. But now we use 9/11 for the excuse for everything, perpetual war for perpetual peace. So where do? We go to Iraq. They've been wanting to go to Iraq for 5 or 6 years before that. The resolution for regime change occurred in 1998 under Clinton. So it was on and on and on. They were just looking for an excuse. The first meeting of this administration, they were devising plans on how to go in. Paul O'Neill couldn't believe his word, what he was hearing. And yet 9/11, the first meeting after 9/11, those up in the administration said, this is our chance. And somebody said, well, it had nothing to do with 9/11. That's beside the point. Let's go get them. They said, well, you have to at least stage an attempt to go into Afghanistan and pretend you're going after Osama bin Laden. So they did that for a few weeks, backed away from Tora Bora, let Osama bin Laden escape into a country that we subsidize, who's a military dictatorship. We help them. They have a nuclear weapon, and they're protecting Osama bin Laden. I mean, it makes no sense whatsoever. They say, well, conditions change, so we have to change our foreign policy. Our foreign policy creates these conditions, and they always will. I would like to put in a word for a word for Christian non-intervention, because there is a just war theory which is very Christian and it's very non-intervention. It means you don't go to war carelessly. And you don't preemptively strike a nation that has not attacked us. So I say this war does not in any way compare to the Christian justification of a just war. Also, if you're conservative and you believe you endorse this war, you should at least have respect for the Constitution and never go into war without a declaration so we can fight it and get it over with. You know, Michael Schur headed up the Osama bin Laden department in the CIA and has written extensively about this. He is the world's expert on understanding Osama bin Laden. He's read everything he's ever written. He has said since the debates have started that Ron Paul is the greatest enemy of Osama bin Laden, and he does not want me to win because it will ruin what he has going for him over there. because his recruiting, it has skyrocketed. Before it was 100 or 200 crazy nuts willing to commit suicide. Now he has thousands. And Zawahiri has been heard to say and has written that they like us over there. They don't want us to leave because we're in their backyard. We're on their sand, and they can pick us off. They can wear us down. So we have succumbed to exactly what they wanted. We are over there, and we're not doing well over there. Also, understanding suicide terrorism is very, very important. Suicide terrorism has a root cause, and it's not radical Islam. If you want the real information on this, you have to read Robert Pape's book on this subject. He's done more research than anybody else by going back and studying every single case. The country that commits the most suicide terrorism is not Islamic. It happens to be Sri Lanka. And the countries that are most radical in their Muslim philosophy, Iran and Sudan, commits no suicide terrorism. And I was convinced he was wrong when I started to read his book, but he convinced me that that isn't the case. And he said the most important element to get somebody willing to commit suicide terrorism is occupation by a foreign force. Now, it is true. We did not have troops in their holy city, but Osama bin Laden used that as a major excuse. He used the Middle East, he used the bombing of Iraq, which had been going on for nearly a decade, and he used troops in Saudi Arabia. But he didn't say Saudi Arabia, he says the Arabian Peninsula. The whole peninsula is holy land to them, including Iraq. And the confirmation of this whole idea of why they come here comes from none other than Paul Wolfowitz. Paul Wolfowitz said, well, we invaded Iraq, and he said, oh, that is good, because now we can take the troops out of Saudi Arabia, which was the incentive for 9/11, and we will just go into Iraq. What he doesn't understand, and this is what Michael Schur explains, all of Saudi Arabia is holy land. So the fact that we don't have troops in Saudi Arabia right now means nothing. We're still over there. So the incentive is still there. So there is so much that could be done and so much could be improved by following basic fundamentals. If it were true that we had to deal with the people most responsible for 9/11, it was not the Iraqis, it was not the Iranians, it was Saudi Arabia. 15 of them. So if you had to declare war, that's where you should have gone to declare war. What we have to remember is the basic fundamentals of this country and our Constitution is non-intervention. Mind our own business. We will be stronger and a lot safer.
Well, I gather we have 20 minutes for questions. Is that right, Mark? Or anyway, let's start some questions. If people have questions, come up to the microphone. And meanwhile, I'll ask one for Iran has threatened nuclear destruction of Israel. What should Israel's response be to this threat? And what should our response be?
I think that one of the things we first of all have to do before you can answer that question is ask the question, is their threat legitimate and real? Do they have the capability of what they are threatening? And if they do, will they do it? Now, the answer to that right now is I don't think they have that capability now, but I don't think that they would hesitate to do it if they had that capability, unless they understand what the consequences are for doing it. I mean, you can let loudmouths run around and bully anybody they want if they feel they can do it without consequences. And so the answer to Iran right now, and that man who claims to be the president of that country, is to make it unquestionably clear that if you do have this capability, we are going to take you out. I mean, what's the purpose? If you're not going to be the world power and don't act like a world power, then why be a world power? I mean, we can come back to our country and never be involved in anything. We can be supine in front of all this stuff, or we can actually do what we have to do to protect ourselves.
Question.
Why be a world power? The reason we're a world power is in case we need to defend ourselves. That's it. You're a world power, and you want to go out and use that power to beat up on other people. My question is to Dinesh, similar area. Why do you feel that our founders, when they broke free of Great Britain and then a few years later instituted our Constitution, why do you think that was a constitution for the entire world? It was strictly for us and our freedom. Why do you insist that our founders created this Constitution for the entire world?
Okay, that's the question.
Well, I'm not saying that the founders created a constitution for the world. The rights of American citizens apply only to us. I would not extend those rights to aliens or prisoners in Guantanamo. Our civil rights are ours as citizens. I agree with that. What I am saying is that those rights were seen as arising out of universal principles. The founders didn't just believe that the European man or the white man or the fellow who read Locke was entitled to liberty, but that this was something that was, in a sense, a universal fire in all human beings. All human beings, in a sense, aspire to it. Now, the founders didn't give it to anybody. They didn't give it to everybody. In fact, Lincoln even said later, the founders declared the right so that the enforcement could follow when the circumstances permitted. He was talking about slavery. Here's the point I want to make. Our opponents have been talking a lot about the fact that freedom is being destroyed in America. Well, you know what's going to destroy freedom in America? Another 9/11. If there was a second 9/11 and a third, America would have to become like Israel, a police state. The fact is, we have not had an attack since 9/11, and that's allowed a lot of us to rest easy, breathe a sigh of relief, and sort of pretend that we can go back to September 10th. And so we're now in a sort of September 10th lull or mode. What we're forgetting is that it's very difficult to defend this country. A free country is very difficult to defend at every border, every port, every airline. If all of us in this room today shut the doors and decided to create a conspiracy in which over the next 6 months we cause havoc in America, do you realize how much havoc we could cause? And if we were willing to die causing it, this country could barely defend itself against us. So the fact is, take us and multiply our numbers by 1,000, and then take people who are willing to strap bullets and kill themselves, and you get a hint of the kind of threat we face. Let's recognize it.
Let me address that.
All right, well, Ron wants to respond to this. Unfortunately, we have to stop at 6:15, which is about now. So, Ron.
Well, you know, I fear more 9/11s too, but in perspective, you have to realize, and I agree with Dinesh, that yes, more and more of 9/11s, there's a threat to our freedom. But it's not going to be a threat from an invasion of a foreign power. It's going to be more Patriot Acts, more Military Commissions Act, more National ID Acts, more loss of habeas corpus, and that's coming from our government, and that's what we ought to be concerned about. That's where our responsibility are. If we want to spread our goodness, which I believe in, it should be without force. It should be by setting a good example, having a vibrant economy and minding our business where people will want to emulate us. You can't do it with the use of force.
I'm afraid that's the end of it. Thank you for a great debate.
Next time we get to the debate,
Nobody wimped out.
of a campaign rally.
It's nice to meet you.
Good meeting you. Thank you.
Thanks, Walter.
This panel was part of the 2007 Freedom Fest in Las Vegas. For more, visit freedomfest.com.